guys, your averages for the quizzes are still really good, so just mark it off of it once we take the quiz after the break too, first couple minutes, just like always. Shouldn't be too. Okay guys, for the sake of time, we want to try to fit in as much of this lecture as possible in this first round that we see you guys, and then the second after the break. But let's talk a little bit about the endocrine system. The endocrine system are like today and also Thursday, the last couple topics for the whole semester. We'll most likely be talking about the communicative properties of the body, both the endocrine and the nervous system. Keep in mind, guys, that you have your lecture exam for next Tuesday on whatever wasn't like whatever after lecture exam 3. So we'll go over those topics, probably a review on Thursday, and then you have your lab exam next Thursday, and then your finals should be like the not next week, but the week after that on Tuesday. And you're good for the whole semester. You guys are almost there, but the wall that you're meeting is like close to a good amount of exams for this class before we let you guys go. So keep that in mind, and we'll talk a little bit about what to see on the final after the break. But in regards to this, let's talk about some very high-yield concepts from the endocrine system. Number one, we want to differentiate the endocrine system from the nervous system. So the nervous system, we're going to talk a little bit about it on Thursday. What it does is it uses a very famous cell that we should have already covered in lab. It's a neuron, and then the neuron goes to the end, so it's an electrical signal, this neuron, and it releases a chemical signal. As you guys can see, the chemical signal is called a neurotransmitter from a neuron, and it transmits a message, and then it affects a cell across from it. It could be another nervous system cell, or it could be a cell at the end. For example, right now, I have my neurons controlling my muscles, releasing the chemicals to allow my muscles to move. And we'll talk a little bit about, on Thursday, and we'll talk about what drugs can affect this, actually, like people smoking cigarettes. We can talk a little bit about what that does with the nervous system. But over here, in the endocrine system today, crine means to secrete in Latin, and endo means inside of or outside of the body, guys. Inside of the body. So the one thing you have to note with the endocrine system is we have glands. Glands are things that secrete. They are ductless, so they don't have a duct. They are ductless glands. That's the endocrine system glands that you have to remember. And they use the blood and release their own chemicals into the blood. The one thing you have to note is the name of the chemicals in the endocrine system are called blank, A, B, C, or D. They're called hormones. Every time you hear a hormone, you should associate that with the endocrine system. So there are two different ways of communication in the body. One so much faster than the other. For example, Dodgers again, but if we have Julio Johnny about to line up in batting, he doesn't want to use the endocrine system. That takes too long. Chemical to the blood, that takes more than a couple seconds. He's going to want to use the nervous system, which is a faster response in the body. If a bear is running towards you 30 miles an hour, you don't want to use the endocrine system, you want to use the nervous system. But if you are trying to regulate sexual ovulation, sexual reproduction, the life cycle that takes from 0 to 28 days that we covered last week for females, then you want to use the endocrine system. It's slower, but more sustained. Slower but more sustained. This is faster, but goes away faster. Yes?
Like responses with the bear, and then something with adrenaline.
Adrenaline.
Is that endocrine?
So it is a mix, but the nervous system controls the adrenal gland. So the nervous system is a faster response. It will release adrenaline, which is epinephrine, norepinephrine, but we'll talk about that soon. Good question. That's towards the end of this lecture. So that's what you guys have to note is you have to differentiate the endocrine versus nervous. Two communicative processes in the body, one faster than the other. So if I ask you, the female reproductive cycle is usually regulated by blank. It's usually regulated by the endocrine system because it takes 28 days. We don't necessarily need to have the nervous system too much into this process. We want something that's more slower but more sustained. Slower but long acting is the endocrine system. So a little mix, guys, a throwback to chapter 11 for Bio 6 is you kind of have to note there are hormones released, and I'll blank it out. There are hormones released inside the blood. The blood touches almost 99.9% of the cells in your body. How the heck are these hormones so specific? For example, in the future, you're going to learn that thyroid-stimulating hormone in the brain gets released, and it goes to only specifically your thyroid gland and affects those cells and no other cells, even though it touches 99.9% of cells in your body. It's like those cells are specific to that hormone because what do they contain on their cell membrane to make them specific? A little throwback to chapter 11, see if you guys can get that with the person next to you. What's on their cell membrane so that they can be specific to these hormones or chemicals? That was throwback from Bio 6. See if you guys can remember what that detail is. If you do, don't say it out loud, just kind of whisper it. I kind of want to hear if people can recall. I'll give you a hint if there's some suffering. So here is a cell that will be affected, and here is a cell that won't. There's something on this cell, on its either membrane or inside of it, but on its membrane, that will allow it to be affected. Shai, what do you think? Close. The extracellular matrix is the jelly outside of the cell, but if we want to talk about what's on the cell membrane, it's a protein, if it's a hint. Any idea, guys? The biggest hint is that the protein starts with an R. So guys, the fact that a cell will be specific to a hormone, that cell, because that hormone rotates around 99.9% of your body in the blood, we want to know that that cell has a receptor. Chemical signals bind to a receptor of the cell that will be affected in the endocrine system. That's why it can release a crap load of hormones in the blood, and only a specific population of cells will be affected by it. It's like that hormone isn't even there for cells that do not have the receptor. Let's go to the next slide. And so what are hormones used for, and what type of hormones are there? Usually we differentiate them by their area of effect. So for example, we have different types of hormones. We have regular hormones that spread throughout the body. We have local regulators. Here we want to talk about two terms that you guys have to note for a final or lecture exam in the future. For local regulators, we have a couple ones. Okay? We have a cell that may release its hormone and it will affect itself. We have a cell that releases a hormone and it will affect itself. Versus a cell that releases a hormone and it will affect a neighboring cell. These two are local regulators. A cell that releases a hormone, crine is to secrete or release. What would you guys say if a cell releases a hormone to affect itself? Would you say that's paracrine or autocrine? Which one releases and automatically affects itself, guys? This one is called autocrine. Crine is to secrete. Auto means it's itself, automatically. Okay. This one, next to or neighboring cell is affected, is the paracrine signaling. So again, there are two types of signalings in the local regulators. There is an autocrine signaling. Cell releases something and it affects itself. A, B, C, or D, autocrine. And then paracrine signaling, key word is neighboring cell. a neighboring cell is affected by another cell by releasing a specific chemical. Those two are local regulators. Okay? And what Shai was talking about in regards to this, we'll actually hold off, but he was talking about adrenaline being released when a bear is running towards you 30 miles an hour. Adrenaline is controlled by the nervous system, so we usually call it a neurohormone. Anything that is released by the nervous system or controlled by the nervous system is a hormone associated with neurohormones. Neuro means nervous system in that case. And then here, if it's just the nervous system alone affecting something else, no endocrine stuff, then we call these neurotransmitters, or NTs, that will actually differentiate more soon. True or false, are there pheromones being released in the human body? Yes or no? We kind of talked about one example. There are pheromones being released in the human body. The syncing up of female menstrual cycles is an example called the McClintock effect. There are probably more, but there's many more in other organisms. Okay? Guys, I don't care if you're this level or a postgraduate level, medical school, DPT, you name it. When we talk about the hormones, we usually differentiate them between three types of hormones. We actually pair the first two together, but let's just differentiate between the three. We have polypeptide hormones, which is a crap load of proteins, or a big molecule. We have amino acid-derived hormones, which is smaller molecules, not proteins yet, but smaller versions of them. And then we have steroid hormones. The one thing you have to get tested on is you have to differentiate their area and mode of effect in the body. Here's where a lot of students always get this flipped. One of these hormones will bind to a receptor inside of the cell, while the other hormone will bind to a receptor outside of the cell. How do you remember the two? A lot of students will try to memorize it and completely forget during the exam, for both here and physiology. Remember, guys, I'm all about understanding. Throughout the semester, I tried to change how you guys think and study for the course. We want you to understand and not memorize the concepts. It takes you further. So again, what is the difference? Two of these guys will bind to a receptor outside of the cell, and one of them will bind to a receptor inside of the cell. The difference is, you have to note, just go back into fundamental biology. So let's talk about steroids versus, I'll put in parentheses, fats, versus amino acid, and then plus polypeptide protein hormones. Okay, so number one, guys, it goes to their characteristics. That should help you remember which one will seep through the cell, which one won't. The number one thing is we have to differentiate which one can readily pass through the cell membrane. That goes back into your fundamental bio. Does anyone want to take a guess which one does not like water? Hydrophobic. Steroids. Hydrophobic. They are very small. And because they're hydrophobic, does that mean these compounds are polar or non-polar? If they're hydrophobic, they don't like water, so they should be an opposite of water. Would that mean these guys are polar or non-polar? Take a wild guess, guys. Non-polar. Yeah, polar means water because they have poles. Non-polar means not water. Fats don't like water, so they are extremely non-polar. Okay? The opposite is true for amino acid and polypeptides. They are fairly larger. They are hydrophilic. They love water because they are polar or charged. Amino acids are usually a negative charge, guys. These guys, larger, hydrophilic, polar, and charged. Okay? Think back to Bio 6. Think back about what properties, which one can readily pass through the membrane and which one cannot. See if you guys can get that with the person next to you and talk about why can these things pass and why can't these things not pass. See if you guys can get which one can pass and which one can't. And then we'll go over it too. But try your best, guys. It's a guess. Like you may not remember it. I don't expect you to. We're just gonna bring it up. Let's see if you guys can get it. the question in the future will be, which of the following is the correct type of hormone that is known to readily pass through the membrane and bind to a receptor inside of the membrane versus a hormone that can't pass through the membrane and bind to a receptor outside? See which one can pass through and which one can't. We'll go over that. Hopefully for some of the Bio6 students that took me, this is a long time ago though. But think back to the nature of the sound. It's a little harder, guys. Questions are getting a little harder towards the end. I don't expect you guys to know. It's been a while, so I'm going to take a guess. Okay, and then what are the tails? Are they hydrophobic? That's close. Yeah, it's opposite. Yeah, so then tails will only allow light to go through. So guys, tails, the tails will only allow stuff like them to go through. And then the question is, what are the tails? Are they resembling these guys or these guys? If they're resembling one or the other, they'll allow that one to go through. Are the tails hydrophilic, hydrophobic? Think about where they're placed. Go ahead, any wild guesses for you guys over here? So the tails, since they're trapped in the middle, they're hydrophobic, meaning that they'll allow hydrophobic stuff to get through. So you have two hormones. Which one will go through readily? Now related to these hormones. So in Bio6, guys, you learned that look at the tails versus it's a phospholipid bilayer in the cell membrane. There are the tails in the middle trapped. They're afraid of water, so they hide away from water. While the heads are the ones that like water on the outside versus that like the water in the inside. The tails don't like water, and the tails will only allow stuff like them to go through. Meaning, steroid hormones can readily pass through the membrane, so they don't bind to a receptor on it, they bind to a receptor in it. Which of the following, this is a physiology question, this is an MCAT question, this is an NCLEX question, this is a question in the future that's very common in physiology too. Which of the following are correct type of hormones that pass through the membrane readily and bind to an intracellular receptor, intra means within, then any hormone that resembles steroids are the ones that do that, okay? So if you see in the future estrogen, testosterone, all of those are fatty hormones that we'll learn in the future. These guys over here. And so what you have to note, guys, is steroid hormones do that, and we'll cover exactly what they do after later. Well, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about it. So number one, look at this, guys. Lipid-soluble hormones, resembling fats, readily pass through the membrane and bind to the intracellular receptor. Lipid-soluble hormones. While water-soluble hormones cannot pass through the thick hydrophobic region in the middle, so they can't get through, so they have to bind to a receptor on the cell membrane. Receptor on cell membrane.
Not the water soluble?
Yeah, water soluble, large hydrophilic means water soluble. Very good. So again, guys, the amino acids and the polypeptide hormones are water soluble. They cannot get through the thick hydrophobic region, so they have to attach to a cell membrane receptor on the cell membrane. Lipid soluble hormones can pass through, so they have to bind to a receptor inside. Okay. So let's talk about some examples, guys. For the future, at the end of this lecture, you have to know a good list of lipid soluble hormones. For example, we have estrogen is one. Let's write that down. Estrogen is a lipid fat-soluble hormones. Testosterone, cortisol, and those three for now. Estrogen, testosterone, and cortisol are fat-soluble hormones. They are known to bind in a receptor inside of the cell membrane. However, really big and charged hormones like insulin need to bind to a receptor on the cell membrane. Which is why we need insulin to allow glucose to come in. But we'll talk about that later, guys. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now let's talk about what happens after the binding. it's very important that you guys have to note that, and it's highly testable, guys. What happens after the binding? We talk about it in chapter 11 last semester. So what happens after the binding is I'm going to actually do a little thing. If I get locked out, please let me back in. But I'm going to try to prove my point. Which one did we say is the correct type of hormone that can't readily pass through the membrane, so it has to bind on a receptor on the cell membrane? Water soluble or lipid soluble? Water soluble. What are the two types of hormones that are water soluble? There is polypeptide hormones, and there is amino acid derived hormones. They're charged, they're large, they're non, or they're polar. Okay, so they are binding here. And so we have a problem though, guys. Water soluble. The problem is if I bind, this is an important message. If an important message binds on the receptor on the cell membrane, that's the equivalent of me, an important message trying to teach you guys, going outside of the, please let me back in if I get locked But as you guys can see, that's equivalent of an important message of hormone not being able to get into the classroom to teach you guys an important lecture. So there has to be an indirect way to put in the message, right? We get it finally, but I got locked out. I did that for the other class too. I still got locked out. So just note, guys, they can't get in. So what they do is they have to indirectly input the message. They have to make a cascade effect where the binding of the receptor will cause the activation of enzyme 1, for example, which causes the activation of enzyme 2, which causes a domino effect. And then you have an effect in the cell. Okay? That is, guys, very fast. Lipids or water-soluble hormones can blend in the blood, so they don't need to have a special way. They just find the receptor on the cell membrane. Boom, 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 you have an effect. Okay? The only thing is, let's talk about lipid-soluble hormones, like steroids. Steroids cannot, or can, here's the cell membrane, steroid hormones can pass through the cell membrane, so they have to bind within a receptor inside of the cell membrane. What you have to note is what is the effect after that? Who here thinks the environment directly plays an effect with turning on people's DNA and turning them off? Who here thinks the environment has an effect with someone's DNA directly? What was that?
Maybe genetics and environment.
Yeah, genetics and environment. Guys, the steroids are outside of the cell. This is the environment. What happens is the receptor will head to the nucleus, turn on your DNA, and then back in Bio 6, you make RNA that leaves to find a ribosome to make proteins. And then you finally have an effect. Turns on your DNA directly, guys, the environment. Okay? But look at this. Tell me which one takes longer. The more steps I list out, the longer it'll take. Let's have you guys guess. For water-soluble hormones, it's easy. They blend in the blood. They find the receptor on the cell membrane. Boom, 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 you have an effect. For lipid-soluble hormones, guys, they can't blend in the blood. They need a special way to be transported. They find the cell. They pass through the cell membrane. They find an intracellular receptor. They head to the nucleus. They turn on your DNA. Then they make mRNA. Then they make proteins. And finally, we have an effect. Which one takes longer, guys? Which one took more steps? It takes way longer. It's way faster. Right here. Okay? The lengths you will be tested on. Which one takes longer? Steroid hormones take way longer because they need all of the steps to directly turn on your DNA. So keep that in mind, guys. Any professor would just list them out, but you don't understand until we actually walk it through. That's how we get it. So as you guys can see, water-soluble hormones will go to the blood, will find a receptor on the cell membrane, will start a domino effect, and then you finally have an effect fairly fast. Okay? Fat-soluble hormones need a special way to get to the blood, need to find the receptor inside of the cell membrane and do the whole thing, DNA, RNA to proteins. It takes a long time. It takes quite a long time. But we don't need that. Like testosterone, estrogen, to regulate a female life cycle, whatever, we need that long time. We don't want to be in a rush. Okay? So we finally brought this up, guys. But an example of a water-soluble hormone, one of the most important hormones, and we'll talk about the origin again. I think the origin of the whole, kind of randomly in the morning, is epinephrine. Epinephrine is one of the most important hormones for our survival. Epinephrine and another hormone, both paired together that we don't need to bring up, they're otherwise known as adrenaline. This is short-term fast stress that we need to react to. Okay? Epinephrine, when released in your body, allows a person to do inhuman things. For example, there was a car accident that happened. The guy in the car watched this car accident. He was a comic book writer, the future of the Hulk. He goes down, car flips over, the car is bent over here at the corner, and then we have a little baby, the mother's child. The mother's like 112 pounds underneath the car. She's trying to call for police and everything, no reaction. What ends up happening is adrenaline is in her body. She was able to lift that couple-ton car by herself. The guy sees that because epinephrine is in her system. Epinephrine allows you to do inhuman things for the sake of survival. Epinephrine binds to a receptor. It is a water-soluble hormone. It binds to the receptor on the cell membrane.
Water-soluble?
Water-soluble. Which of the following answer choices below is correct property of epinephrine? It is water-soluble, meaning that it has to bind on the receptor on the cell membrane, not within. It's water-soluble. Very good, very good. So the one thing you guys have to note is chapter 11, we talked a little bit about this. I'm going to blanket, I'm not going to blanket it, I'll just tell you guys, but GPCR from chapter 11 last semester is one of the most common types of pathways that we see. Epinephrine uses that pathway. A couple of things with GPCR, you may, and it is part of curriculum, to possibly test you guys on these steps, because they brought up in chapter 11, we have to bring up the details now. Number one, GPCR, when it binds to a receptor, this is epinephrine, it activates G protein by GTP. GTP is like energy. It will activate later on adenylyl cyclase. When I think about cyclase, I think about cyclic AMP. Cyclase, cyclic AMP. It takes ATP, puts it into a CAMP, and then effects happen after that. PKA with effects. These steps, guys, from chapter 11 were high yield. They are still high yield in Bio 7, but also will be high yield also in physiology. So study them now, get them right now, and you get them right in another semester for physio. But these ones will have to go in more detail in physiology. So again, we drop off here, but just note that for the sake of time. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about another one. Yes?
Does that, you might test it?
Yeah, it's up for grabs. It has to be just because it's in physio too. It will be tested for sure in physio. So another thing to note, guys, lipid-soluble hormones, we don't really need too much of that. Just note that it turns on your DNA to make RNA to make proteins. We'll take a break soon, but let's go to the next slide a little longer. So let's take a 5-minute break right here. We'll leave this on the pathway you need to know for lipid-soluble hormones. They pass readily through the membrane. They find an intracellular receptor. They head to your DNA, make mRNA, and make proteins. Then we have an effect in the cell. So let's take a 5-minute break around there, guys. And then we'll come back at 9:37, talking a little bit more about continuing this. Very good. Ooh, perfect transition. Now we're just going to talk about